Tonight, we follow the long and patient story of how ancient ships were built, not just as machines of wood and sail, but as living structures shaped by forests, hands, belief, war, trade, and ambition. We will move from the first hollowed tree trunks, drifting down quiet rivers, to the vast shipyards of ancient civilizations. We will stand beside master shipwrights as they choose timber, bend planks with fire, stitch hulls with rope, and invent joinery strong enough to face open water. Along the way, we will uncover forgotten techniques, lost shipyards buried beneath cities, experimental archaeology, and the rediscovery of ancient vessels thousands of years later. This is not only the story of ships, it is the story of how human beings learn to trust wood against the sea, and it begins in a forest. Long before a ship ever touched water, it stood rooted in silence. In a dense forest somewhere along a prehistoric riverbank, an oak tree grew slowly through centuries of wind and frost. Its rings thickened year by year, recording droughts, storms, and summers of heavy rain. It did not know it was being measured by time. It did not know that one day, human hands would walk toward it with purpose. The forest was not empty in those days. Small communities lived along the water's edge. They understood currents, fish migrations, and seasonal floods. They crossed rivers on fallen logs. They lashed reeds together into floating bundles. They watched driftwood move downstream and wondered where it might end. At first, water was a boundary. Then it became a path. No one knows exactly when the first person looked at a floating trunk and imagined shaping it. There are no written records from that moment, no preserved voice describing the idea. But archaeology offers quiet clues. In places like Northern Europe, Africa, and Asia, ancient dugout canoes have been found buried in river mud, some over 8,000 years old. One of the oldest known examples, discovered in what is now the Netherlands, shows careful tool marks along its inner walls. Another, unearthed in Africa, reveals controlled charring used to hollow the interior. These were not accidents. They were deliberate acts of transformation. The leap from floating log to vessel required something profound. Trust. Imagine the scene. A group stands beside a recently felled tree. The trunk is immense, heavy with sap, its bark rough beneath the hand. Stone axes have bitten into its base for hours. The air smells of split wood and effort. There is no blueprint, no measurement system beyond the eye and memory of elders. The tree falls. In that moment, something changes. It is no longer forest. It is material. Early boat builders did not separate craft from ritual. In many cultures, trees chosen for vessels were honored. Even thousands of years later, Norse shipbuilders would whisper words before cutting oak. In prehistoric times, that reverence may have been even stronger. A tree that would face water had to be worthy. The process was slow. Fire was controlled along the trunk's centerline, carefully contained so it would burn inward, but not through. Charred wood was scraped away with stone tools. The builders worked patiently, hollowing the interior one layer at a time. Too thin, and the hull would split. Too thick, and it would sit too low in water. There was no room for error. These first dugout canoes were heavy, but they floated. That was miracle enough. At first they hugged shorelines and followed gentle rivers. But gradually, confidence expanded. Fishermen pushed slightly farther from land. Traders realized they could carry more than they could by foot. Families crossed waters that once divided them, and with each journey, the relationship between wood and water deepened. What is remarkable is not merely that early humans built boats, but that they refined them. Over generations, certain trees proved better than others. Oak was strong and resilient. Pine was lighter but softer. Builders learned to read grain direction, to predict how wood would warp as it dried. The forest became a catalogue of future hulls. Archaeologists studying ancient dugouts have found asymmetrical shaping, subtle design improvements that stabilized balance. Some show raised ends carved directly from the trunk, early attempts at wave deflection. These refinements suggest experimentation. Failure must have happened. Boats must have tipped, cracked, sunk. Yet knowledge accumulated. Along coastal regions, another innovation emerged: reed boats. In areas where large timber was scarce, such as parts of Mesopotamia and along the Nile, builders bundled reeds tightly together and bound them with rope. The resulting craft were surprisingly buoyant, flexible, repairable. The idea was transformative. A boat no longer needed to be carved from a single tree. It could be assembled. Assembly changed everything. Once separate pieces were joined, vessels could grow, larger than any single trunk. Planks could be shaped individually. Hulls could curve outward. Capacity increased. Ambition followed. We begin to see the early ancestors of true shipbuilding. But how did builders learn to join wood securely? Before metal nails became common, early civilizations relied on joinery techniques that demanded extraordinary precision. Mortise-and-tenon joints, where a projecting piece fits tightly into a carved cavity, may have evolved from woodworking traditions on land. Pegs secured planks together. Fiber ropes lashed frames internally. It was engineering born from observation rather than theory. And always, there was the question of the open sea. Rivers are forgiving. Lakes are contained. But beyond the coastline, the horizon curves into uncertainty. Waves move differently. Winds shift without warning. Salt corrodes and swells wood. At some unknown point, a builder reinforced a hull, not just for floating, but for surviving impact. This was the birth of seafaring. In Southeast Asia, ancient maritime cultures developed outriggers, stabilizing floats attached to the main hull. This innovation allowed narrow boats to resist capsizing in rougher water. Meanwhile, Mediterranean communities experimented with broader beams for stability. Different environments demanded different solutions, and through all of this, shipbuilding knowledge remained largely oral. A master showed an apprentice where to cut. A father taught a daughter how to seal seams with resin or animal fat. There were no written manuals. If a community vanished, its techniques could vanish with it, which makes the survival of certain vessels all the more astonishing. In England, the discovery of the Bronze Age boat at Dover revealed complex plank construction, dating back more than 3,000 years. Sewn planks, stitched together with yew withies, created a flexible hull capable of channel crossings. This was no river canoe. It was a seagoing craft. Imagine the hands that stitched it. The builder would have selected oak boards split carefully along the grain. Holes were drilled with bronze tools. Fibers threaded through, tightened, sealed. The hull would flex slightly in waves rather than resist rigidly. An elegant solution to marine stress. It is easy to underestimate these early builders because they lacked iron or modern mathematics. But what they possessed was intimate material knowledge. They understood wood as a living substance, even after it was cut. They anticipated swelling, shrinkage, tension. They listened to creaks in the hull as signs. And gradually, shipbuilding began to separate from simple boat making. Certain individuals became known for their skill. Communities relied on them. Leaders commissioned larger projects. Trade routes expanded beyond sight of land. Wooden hulls began carrying not just people, but goods: obsidian, amber, grain, metals. Water became highway, but forests were not infinite. As vessels grew larger, selecting timber became strategic. Builders sought long, straight trunks for keels. Naturally curved branches were prized for ribs because their shape matched structural needs. Nothing was random. The ship began in the forest long before the first cut. In some regions, entire groves were managed for future construction. Though primitive compared to later naval forestry programs, this early awareness connected land management to maritime ambition. Civilization was learning that ships required planning decades in advance. And yet, for all this progress, something was still missing: control of wind. The earliest boats relied primarily on paddles or poles, but somewhere along the Nile and in Mesopotamia, humans began harnessing cloth against air. A simple square sail, mounted on a central mast, transformed movement. Now a vessel could travel longer distances with less human exhaustion. This innovation would change history, but it required stronger hulls. A sail exerts force. Wind pushes not only forward but sideways. Without internal bracing and a secure mast step, the structure could tear apart. Thus, shipbuilding evolved again. Internal frames became more deliberate. Crossbeams strengthened the hull. Builders began thinking in 3 dimensions, not merely hollowing wood, but constructing a skeletal structure that distributed stress. The vessel became architecture, and architecture invites ambition. By the late prehistoric and early ancient periods, communities around the Mediterranean were no longer content with river crossings. They explored coastlines. They mapped seasonal winds. They established trade with distant shores. Each successful voyage reinforced belief in wooden walls between humanity and chaos. Yet storms must have terrified them. Lightning striking masts, waves towering above decks, the groan of timbers at night. Some ships did not return. What did those losses teach the builders? Which reinforcements were added, quietly, after tragedy? We can only infer from later design improvements: thicker keels, raised prows, stitched seams sealed more carefully. Shipbuilding knowledge was written in survival. By the time the first great civilizations emerged along the Nile, Tigris, and Euphrates, boat construction was already ancient. But something new was about to happen. Scale. Along the Nile, predictable flooding encouraged larger transport vessels. Massive stone blocks for monuments needed river movement. Trade expeditions required cargo capacity beyond dugouts. And in Egypt, where native large timber was scarce, builders faced a unique problem: how to construct large ships without abundant forests. Their solution would change maritime engineering forever. But before we follow that river south beneath the desert sun, it is worth returning once more to the forest. Somewhere, another oak stands. It grows unaware that generations of builders now understand exactly what it might become. They will look at its curvature and see a keel. They will measure its height and imagine mast potential. They will fell it not simply to float, but to voyage. The transformation from tree to ship is no longer experimental. It is intentional. And along the Nile, intention is becoming empire. In the next part, we step into Egyptian shipyards, where planks are joined without nails, where sacred boats carry pharaohs toward eternity, and where shipbuilding becomes not merely survival, but state power. The river is waiting, and so the story moves from forest shadow into light. The Nile does not rush like northern rivers. It moves with patience, wide and deliberate, reflecting the sky in long ribbons of bronze at sunset. For thousands of years it rose and fell with dependable rhythm, flooding its banks, retreating, and leaving behind fertile black soil. Along this river, one of the world's first great civilizations discovered that water was not merely a boundary, but a spine, a corridor of movement running through the heart of its world. By the time dynastic Egypt emerged, boat building was already ancient knowledge. Yet here, along the Nile, it would evolve into something more organized, more ambitious, and more symbolic than before. Egypt did not possess vast forests of towering oak like those of Europe. Native timber was limited: acacia, sycamore fig, tamarisk. Useful, but often short and irregular. Large straight beams suitable for keels and long planks were rare. This scarcity forced Egyptian builders to think differently. Where other cultures carved vessels from single massive trunks, Egypt began perfecting construction from assembled planks. The transformation was subtle at first. Early Nile boats were still shaped from bundled papyrus reeds, especially in the pre-dynastic period. These reed boats were light and surprisingly durable in calm waters. Papyrus stalks were cut, dried, bundled tightly, and bound together with rope made from plant fiber. The ends were drawn upward and inward, forming elegant crescent shapes that mirrored the curve of the river's horizon. Reed boats flexed with the water. They did not resist the Nile's gentle current. For fishing, short travel, and ritual use, they were ideal. But reeds had limits. They absorbed water over time. They were vulnerable to abrasion and decay. As Egyptian society centralized and monumental building began, the demands placed upon watercraft increased dramatically. Stone for pyramids and temples had to move along the Nile. Trade expeditions traveled south toward Nubia and east toward the Red Sea. Officials required transport. Armies required transport. The vessel was no longer personal. It became administrative. In workshops along the Nile's banks, shipwrights began shaping wooden planks individually and fastening them edge to edge. But without widespread iron tools or metal nails in early periods, how were these planks held together? The answer lay in a joinery technique that would define Mediterranean shipbuilding for centuries: the mortise-and-tenon joint. A mortise is a carved cavity. A tenon is a projecting tongue of wood, shaped to fit precisely within it. Egyptian shipwrights carved small rectangular mortises along the edges of planks. Into these they inserted tenons made from harder wood. The planks were then pulled tight and secured with wooden pegs driven through both plank and tenon. The effect was remarkable. Instead of relying on external lashings alone, the hull became internally locked, plank to plank, like interwoven fingers. Archaeological discoveries confirm the sophistication of this method. When the funerary ship of Khufu was discovered buried beside the Great Pyramid at Giza, disassembled but intact after more than 4,500 years, scholars were astonished. The vessel, often called the Khufu ship, measured over 40 meters in length. Its planks were joined precisely with mortise and tenon construction, held together without a single metal nail. Each plank had been shaped carefully, its edges carved to match its neighbors. The joints were tight enough to make the hull watertight once the wood swelled from contact with river moisture. This was plank-first construction, a method in which the outer shell of the vessel was built before internal framing was fully installed. The hull itself defined the shape. Only afterward were internal ribs added to reinforce the structure. It was an approach different from later frame-first traditions, and it required extraordinary skill. The builder had to visualize the full curvature of the ship from the very beginning. Imagine standing in such a shipyard. The Nile glitters beyond the sandbank. Cedar logs imported from Lebanon lie stacked nearby. Precious timber traded across hundreds of miles. Egyptian wood was insufficient for vessels of great size. Thus, maritime trade itself supplied the materials for maritime expansion. Workers smooth planks with adzes, their rhythmic strokes steady and unhurried. A master shipwright inspects the alignment of mortises carved along an edge. He does not rely on written diagrams. His knowledge is embodied, passed from teacher to apprentice through repetition. Nearby, ropes are twisted from flax. Resin is heated gently to seal seams. Wooden pegs are carved from harder wood species to secure joints firmly. The keel, if present in early Egyptian ships, was subtle compared to later Mediterranean designs. Nile vessels did not need deep keels for open ocean stability. Instead, many were relatively flat-bottomed to navigate shallow waters during low flood seasons. Steering was accomplished not by a central rudder, but by large steering oars mounted at the stern. Above, a single square sail might be rigged to a central mast. Egyptian sails were often mounted between two spars, allowing them to be lowered and raised with some flexibility. On the Nile, prevailing north winds meant that vessels traveling south could use sail, while northbound journeys often relied on current and oars. This predictable wind system shaped hull design. Stability was essential, but oceanic storm resistance was less urgent, at least at first. Yet Egypt did not confine itself to the Nile. Reliefs carved into temple walls depict seafaring expeditions to Punt, a region believed to lie somewhere along the Red Sea coast, possibly near modern Eritrea or Somalia. These voyages required vessels capable of open water navigation beyond the gentle Nile corridor. How were Nile river ships adapted for sea travel? The answer may lie in reinforcement techniques. Additional lashings were used to hold planks tight against stress. Hull curvature was increased slightly for wave resistance. Some ships may have included tension cables running longitudinally along the deck to prevent hogging, the tendency of long hulls to bend upward at bow and stern under their own weight. These tensioning systems, sometimes called hogging trusses in modern terminology, demonstrate a growing awareness of structural physics, even if ancient builders described it in practical rather than theoretical terms. In temple scenes, ships of Punt voyages are shown laden with exotic goods, incense trees, gold, animal skins. The vessels are large, multi-oared, and carry prominent sails. They represent not experimentation, but confidence. And yet, even as Egyptian shipbuilding grew increasingly technical, it remained deeply symbolic. Boats were not only for transport, they were vessels of the sun. In Egyptian cosmology, the sun god Ra traveled across the sky by boat each day and passed through the underworld by boat each night. The image of the solar bark became central to religious life. Pharaohs were believed to journey with the gods in sacred ships after death. The burial of Khufu's ship beside his pyramid was not merely ceremonial decoration. it was provision for eternity. This dual identity, practical machine and sacred symbol, shaped the care invested in construction. A poorly built vessel was not only dangerous, it was disrespectful. We often imagine ancient engineering as crude, yet the precision of Egyptian joinery tells another story. When modern researchers reassembled the Khufu ship in the 20th century, they found that each plank fit with astonishing accuracy. The hull design created natural hydrodynamic efficiency, even though its builders lacked formal mathematics. They possessed accumulated experience. It is worth considering the logistics of such construction. Large ships required coordinated labor. Timber had to be transported, shaped and stored. Workspaces needed organization. The Nile's flood cycles likely influenced building schedules. High water facilitated transport, while low water exposed work areas. Shipyards may not have resembled the massive dry docks of later empires, but they were structured environments of industry. Workers specialized in tasks: cutting, shaping, drilling, pegging, sealing. Over time, this specialization produced innovation. Mortise and tenon joints became more numerous and tightly spaced. Planks were fitted edge to edge with increasing precision. Sealing materials improved. Mixtures of resin, beeswax, and fibers ensured watertight seams. One of the mysteries scholars continue to explore is how Egyptian builders ensured hull symmetry without modern measuring tools. Some theories suggest the use of measuring cords knotted at intervals. Others propose visual alignment techniques based on central axes drawn along the keel line. Whatever their method, the results were balanced enough to withstand river transport of immense stone loads. But the Nile was not the Mediterranean. As Egyptian maritime activity extended outward, it encountered other shipbuilding traditions. The Levantine coast, home to emerging Phoenician communities, would soon refine plank construction even further, spreading mortise and tenon techniques across the Mediterranean basin. Knowledge travels as surely as cargo. And so Egyptian innovations did not remain isolated. They became part of a broader maritime conversation. Still, there were limits. Egyptian ships, though large, were not designed for ramming warfare. Their hulls were not reinforced for violent impact. Their primary function remained transport of goods, officials, and divine symbolism. Beyond the Nile Delta, other cultures were beginning to experiment with something more aggressive. Along the Aegean coasts, communities surrounded by islands faced a different maritime reality. Narrow channels, unpredictable winds, and inter-island competition demanded speed and maneuverability. There, the ship would become something sharper. But before we leave Egypt entirely, consider one more image. A completed vessel rests beside the Nile at dusk. Its sail is furled. The planks gleam faintly in fading light. Workers step back, hands still scented with cedar and resin. The hull is quiet, but within its joinery lies accumulated generations of learning, from hollowed trees to pegged planks, from reed bundles to tensioned beams. The transformation is profound. Wood is no longer simply hollowed, it is engineered, and once engineering enters the story, ambition accelerates. In the Eastern Mediterranean, where bronze tools grow stronger and rival cities eye each other across narrow waters, shipwrights are about to adapt these techniques for conflict. The vessel will narrow, the bow will sharpen, speed will matter more than cargo, and the age of the warship will begin. As Egyptian ships moved steadily along the Nile and outward toward the Red Sea, the wider Mediterranean was becoming a different kind of arena. Here, The sea was not a single predictable river flowing between desert banks. It was broken into islands, peninsulas, narrow straits, and sudden storms. Distances between shores were often small enough to see land on clear days, yet large enough to demand commitment once a vessel pushed away from harbour. The coastline folded into itself, creating natural ports and hidden coves. In such geography, ships were not merely tools of transport, they were instruments of advantage. Across the waters of the Aegean, the people of Bronze Age Crete, the civilization we now call the Minoans, developed a maritime culture that depended on movement between islands. Their frescoes show long, elegant vessels cutting through stylized waves, prows raised high, oars dipping in synchronized rhythm. These ships were not the broad cargo carriers of the Nile. They were sleeker, designed for agility. The Minoans left few direct ship remains behind, but artistic depictions and archaeological harbour sites suggest a growing refinement in hull shaping. Plank construction continued, likely influenced by Eastern Mediterranean traditions. Mortise-and-tenon joinery spread westward, binding hulls with increasing structural strength. Bronze tools changed everything. With harder edges than stone, bronze adzes and chisels allowed cleaner cuts, more precise joints, and smoother hull surfaces. Shipwrights could carve mortises deeper and shape planks more evenly. Symmetry improved, efficiency increased, and with efficiency came experimentation. The earliest true warships were not yet the massive triremes of later centuries. They began modestly. Long, narrow hulls built for speed rather than cargo. Their primary propulsion came from oarsmen seated in a single line along each side. A sail might be used for longer travel, but in moments of maneuvering, muscle ruled. Speed was protection. In the fragmented world of Aegean islands, disputes could erupt quickly. Trade routes overlapped. Wealth moved by sea. A vessel capable of outrunning or intercepting another vessel offered immediate advantage. Somewhere during this period, a profound shift occurred in ship design. The bow began to harden. Instead of a purely curved, ornamental prow, builders started reinforcing the forward structure. Timber was layered and shaped into a projecting form at waterline height. At first, this may have been accidental, a byproduct of strengthening the hull. But gradually, intention sharpened. The idea that a ship itself could be used as a weapon was revolutionary. Archaeologists studying later shipwrecks have found evidence of bronze-sheathed rams mounted at the bow. Though most surviving examples date from later classical periods, their conceptual roots lie in these earlier experiments. Reinforcing the prow allowed a vessel to strike another at speed, damaging planking below the waterline. It was a terrifying innovation. Unlike land warfare, where soldiers met face to face, naval combat introduced a new dimension of impact. Wood against wood, momentum amplified by water. To survive such stress, hulls had to evolve. Builders began narrowing beam-to-length ratios, producing longer and more slender forms. This increased speed but required careful balancing. Too narrow, and the vessel risked instability. Too broad, and it sacrificed maneuverability. Internal bracing became more deliberate. Frames were added earlier in construction, rather than after the hull shell was completed. Crossbeams stiffened the structure. Tension within planks had to be anticipated, not merely corrected. In the Eastern Mediterranean, another seafaring culture rose alongside these developments. The Phoenicians, originating along the Levantine coast in cities such as Tyre and Sidon, Phoenician shipwrights became legendary. They inherited and refined mortise and tenon techniques, building robust merchant ships capable of crossing open Mediterranean waters. Their trade networks stretched from the Near East to Iberia. While their merchant vessels were broad and capacious, Phoenician builders also experimented with faster craft suited for escort and defense. These ships balanced cargo function with agility. The Phoenicians were master traders, but they understood vulnerability. A merchant fleet required protection, and so shipbuilding divided into categories: cargo carriers and purpose-built warships. Meanwhile, on the Greek mainland, Mycenaean communities watched these maritime developments carefully. Their fortified hilltop cities relied on access to sea routes for trade in metals and luxury goods. Control of coastal waters became strategic. Linear B tablets, some of the earliest written records from Greece, reference maritime activity, though details of ship construction remain sparse. Still, archaeological evidence from coastal settlements suggests organized shipyards and storage facilities for maritime equipment. Shipbuilding was no longer seasonal improvisation. It was institutional. In sheltered bays, slipways may have been constructed, simple ramps allowing vessels to be hauled ashore for repair. Timber stockpiles were maintained. Specialized craftsmen shaped oars, carved mast steps, and reinforced bow structures. And always, there was learning through loss. Storms in the Aegean can rise quickly, funneling winds through island channels. A hull that performed well in calm harbour might twist under open water strain. Each failure became quiet instruction. One innovation that may have emerged from such experience was the gradual addition of a second bank of oars. The birem, a vessel with two vertical levels of rowers, increased power without excessively lengthening the hull. This allowed for greater speed and force during impact. The exact origins of the birem are debated among historians, but by the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age, multi-level rowing systems were developing. Imagine the complexity of designing such a ship. Rowers seated at different heights required staggered oar ports. The hull sides had to support additional internal bracing. Weight distribution became critical. The shipwright had to think not only in terms of wood and water, but of human bodies moving in coordination. The vessel became choreography. To build such ships required not only craftsmanship, but planning. Timber selection grew increasingly strategic. Long, straight trunks for keels were prized. Naturally, curved branches were sought for ribs, their grain following structural lines for strength. Forests near coastal settlements were harvested carefully, sometimes aggressively. As demand increased, timber had to be transported from inland regions. Maritime expansion placed pressure on terrestrial ecosystems. The relationship between forest and fleet deepened. By the late Bronze Age, Mediterranean shipbuilding had become a shared technological language, though dialects differed by region. Egyptian mortise and tenon precision blended with Levantine cargo expertise. Aegean hull narrowing influenced later Greek warship design. But then came disruption. Around 1200 BCE, the eastern Mediterranean experienced widespread upheaval, the so-called Bronze Age collapse. Cities were destroyed, trade networks fractured. The mysterious groups later referred to as the Sea Peoples moved across waters in large numbers, attacking coastal settlements. Ships were central to this chaos. Egyptian reliefs at Medinet Habu depict naval battles against invading forces. The carvings show ships with high prows and sterns, crowded with warriors. Some vessels appear similar in construction to Aegean types, suggesting shared or captured technologies. For shipwrights, such instability meant adaptation. In uncertain times, speed and maneuverability became survival traits. Hulls may have been reinforced further at stress points. Internal lashings supplemented joinery. The prow grew more aggressive in profile. And yet, amidst warfare, trade slowly resumed. Iron tools gradually replaced bronze in many regions, offering harder cutting edges and greater availability. Iron nails would eventually supplement traditional wooden pegs, though mortise and tenon construction persisted for centuries due to its reliability. By the early first millennium, BCE, Greek communities were consolidating maritime knowledge into increasingly specialized warships. The stage was set for a vessel that would dominate classical naval warfare, the trireme. But before that refinement could occur, shipbuilding had to become standardized. Standardization requires something beyond individual mastery. It demands state involvement. In the emerging city-states of Greece, particularly Athens, naval power would become a matter of survival. Shipyards would expand. Rowing systems would be optimized. Construction timelines would compress. The warship would no longer be a coastal experiment. It would become policy. As the Mediterranean entered the Archaic period, the lessons of Bronze Age experimentation, plank joinery, reinforced bows, multi-level rowing, converged. The vessel was now leaner, sharper, built for deliberate collision. Wood had been hollowed in forests. It had been pegged along the Nile. It had been stitched across Bronze Age seas. Now, it would be engineered for impact. In the harbours of Greece, beneath hills crowned with stone temples, shipwrights were preparing to refine the warship into its most precise ancient form. They would calculate proportions carefully. They would align 3 tiers of oarsmen with extraordinary coordination. They would transform maritime conflict into an art of geometry and muscle. And when that fleet finally gathered in narrow straits against a vast invading empire, the evolution of ancient shipbuilding would prove decisive. The age of the trireme is approaching. By the time the scattered experiments of the Bronze Age had settled into the more organized rivalries of the early Greek city-states, shipbuilding was no longer an inherited craft practiced quietly along sheltered beaches. It had become a matter of survival, debated in assemblies and financed by public wealth. Timber was counted, rowers were registered, harbours were fortified, and nowhere would this transformation become more deliberate than in Athens. In the early 5th century BCE, Athens was not yet the dominant naval power it would become. It was one city among many, surrounded by rivals, dependent on trade, and increasingly aware of threats rising beyond the Aegean. The Persian Empire loomed to the east, vast, organized and ambitious. Its armies had already moved into Greek territory. Its fleet was formidable. Athens faced a decision that would change shipbuilding forever. The statesman Themistocles recognized something others did not. The future of Athens would not be secured by stone walls alone, but by wooden ones. He argued that newfound silver wealth from the mines at Laurion should not be distributed among citizens as profit, but invested in ships, not dozens, hundreds. This proposal required more than rhetoric. It required infrastructure. Thus, along the coast at Piraeus, Athens began transforming its harbour into one of the most sophisticated naval centres of the ancient world. Ship sheds were constructed, long, narrow, covered structures where vessels could be hauled ashore and protected from sun and rot. Slipways angled into the water. Timber storage yards expanded. Skilled craftsmen were organized into coordinated labor forces. Shipbuilding was no longer seasonal or improvised. It became industrial. At the heart of this transformation stood the trireme, a vessel refined through generations of experimentation into the most precise warship of the ancient Mediterranean. The trireme was long and narrow, measuring roughly 35 to 40 meters in length, yet only about 5 meters wide at its broadest point. Its proportions were deliberate. Speed was paramount. Maneuverability was essential. But unlike earlier single-level galleys, the trireme employed 3 tiers of rowers stacked vertically along each side. This arrangement was a masterpiece of human engineering. The lowest rowers, called thalamites, sat near the waterline. Above them were the zygites. At the top sat the thrinites, whose longer oars extended outward at greater angles. Each oar had to clear the one below it. Each rower had to move in rhythm with the others. The spacing between seats required exact measurement. If the hull were even slightly misaligned, coordination would collapse. The construction of such a vessel began, as always, in the forest. Athens relied heavily on imported timber. Macedonian forests provided long, straight trunks suitable for keels and masts. Oak was favored for structural strength. Pine and fir were used where flexibility and lighter weight were advantageous. Shipwrights selected wood not only for size, but for grain pattern. Naturally curved branches were shaped into ribs, preserving the integrity of the wood's fibers, rather than forcing straight cuts into curved forms. This practice increased durability under stress. Unlike earlier Egyptian plank-first methods, Greek shipbuilders increasingly integrated framing earlier in construction. While mortise and tenon joints still connected planks tightly edge to edge, internal ribs were positioned with careful calculation to maintain hull symmetry and distribute rowing stress. The keel formed the backbone, long, straight, and precisely aligned. From it rose the ribs, shaping the narrow hull. Planks were fitted along these ribs, joined with wooden tenons inserted into mortises carved at regular intervals. Pegs secured the joints. Seams were sealed with pitch and fibers. Every component served speed. The bow projected forward, capped with a bronze ram. This ram was not ornamental. It was the weapon, cast in heavy bronze and shaped to pierce below the waterline of enemy ships. The ram required reinforced timber behind it. Impact forces would travel through the bow into the hull. Without internal strengthening, a trireme could destroy itself in the act of attack. Shipwrights compensated with thicker forward planking and additional crossbeams near the prow. The bow structure became a carefully balanced compromise between strength and weight. Above deck, a light structure supported the rowers' oars and provided minimal space for marines and archers. Triremes were not built for long voyages. They were built for battle in relatively confined waters, where speed and coordination could decide outcomes within minutes. To construct one trireme required skilled labor working in synchronization. To construct 200 required organization on an unprecedented scale. Athens developed a system in which wealthy citizens were assigned financial responsibility for maintaining individual ships, a public service known as the triarchy. This arrangement ensured that vessels were funded, maintained, and ready for deployment. Ship sheds protected hulls from prolonged water exposure, unlike merchant ships that might remain afloat for months. triremes were often hauled ashore after use. This preserved their lightweight structure and reduced maintenance. The relationship between ship and city became intimate. Young Athenian men trained as rowers, practicing coordination in teams. Commanders drilled maneuvers designed to outflank and outpace opponents. The shipwright's craft merged with military doctrine. Hull dimensions influenced tactical possibilities. Tactical needs influenced hull refinement. When the Persian fleet advanced toward Greek waters in 480 BCE, this convergence of craft and policy would be tested. In the narrow straits near the island of Salamis, the Athenian fleet, under the broader Greek alliance, faced a Persian armada that outnumbered them. But numbers alone do not determine naval battle in constrained waters. The trireme was built for such conditions. Its narrow hull and powerful triple-bank rowing system allowed rapid acceleration. Its bronze ram was positioned for calculated strikes. Greek commanders understood how to use geography, forcing the larger Persian fleet into restricted channels where maneuverability was limited. In that engagement, Athenian and allied triremes executed coordinated ramming maneuvers, striking enemy ships at angles that maximized structural damage. The bronze rams tore into planking below the waterline. Water rushed inward. Oars splintered. Confusion spread. The Persian fleet faltered. Victory at Salamis did not end the war entirely, but it altered the balance of power. Athens emerged not merely as a city-state, but as a naval empire. And with empire came expansion of shipbuilding. The Delian League, originally formed as a defensive alliance, gradually evolved into an Athenian maritime network. Tribute from allied cities funded additional fleets. Shipyards at Piraeus expanded further. Standardization improved. The trireme became template. Builders refined proportions based on battle experience. Slight modifications to hull curvature improved speed. Adjustments to oar length increased leverage. Rigging systems were optimized for rapid mast lowering before combat. Since sails were typically removed during battle to prevent entanglement, ship construction timelines shortened. With experienced crews and organized supply chains, a trireme could be built in a matter of months, sometimes less. Maintenance cycles were established. Damaged planks were replaced swiftly. Rams were recast and refitted. The vessel had become modular. Yet this precision came at a cost. Triremes required enormous manpower, approximately 170 rowers per ship, not counting officers and marines. Sustaining a fleet of hundreds demanded thousands of trained citizens. Naval power was no longer simply about wood and bronze. It was about society, structured around maritime commitment. Forests were harvested continuously to maintain fleets. Timber imports intensified. Naval supremacy required environmental foresight, though not always sustainability in the modern sense. Regions supplying ship timber became strategically valuable. Shipbuilding had fully merged with geopolitics. And still, refinement continued. Some experiments explored quadriremes and quinqueremes, vessels with 4 or 5 rowers per vertical section, though not necessarily stacked in 4 or 5 levels. These designs increased mass and impact power, but required further structural reinforcement. The delicate balance between weight and speed remained central. Too heavy, and acceleration suffered. Too light, and durability diminished. Shipwrights navigated these trade-offs through experience rather than written engineering manuals. Knowledge remained embodied, though increasingly institutionalized. By the late 5th century BCE, Athens possessed one of the most formidable naval infrastructures in the Mediterranean. Its dominance, however, would eventually be challenged during the Peloponnesian War against Sparta and its allies. Naval engagements became frequent. Losses mounted on both sides. Shipbuilding remained constant, feeding conflict year after year. But the trireme, elegant and precise, was approaching the limits of its design evolution. Across the Western Mediterranean, another power was rising. One less concerned with agile maneuver and more focused on overwhelming production. Rome watched, learned, and prepared. When it turned its attention toward the sea during conflicts with Carthage, it would face a challenge similar to that once faced by Athens: how to build a fleet quickly enough to survive. Yet Rome's solution would differ. Where Athens refined speed and precision, Rome would industrialize. And in doing so, it would push ancient shipbuilding into a new phase. One defined not by artistry alone, but by replication at scale. The age of the trireme had reshaped naval warfare. The age of mass production was about to begin. As the dominance of Athens waned and the balance of power shifted across the Mediterranean, shipbuilding entered a new phase, one defined less by elegant refinement and more by relentless replication. Rome, for centuries a land-based power, had watched maritime empires rise and fall from a distance. Its early strength came from disciplined legions marching across Italian soil, not fleets maneuvering between islands. Yet geography would eventually force Rome's hand. The Western Mediterranean was dominated by a formidable naval power: Carthage. Carthage possessed generations of maritime experience inherited from Phoenician ancestors. Its shipwrights understood hull design intimately. Its fleets controlled trade routes across North Africa, Spain, and Sicily. When tensions between Rome and Carthage escalated into open conflict during the First Punic War in the 3rd century BCE, Rome confronted an uncomfortable truth. It did not possess a navy capable of matching its rival. The solution Rome chose would transform ancient shipbuilding. According to later Roman historians, a Carthaginian quinquereme, a large warship powered by complex rowing arrangements, ran aground along the Italian coast. Roman engineers examined it carefully, studying its proportions, joinery, and internal structure. Whether this account is embellished or not, the essential truth remains. Rome learned by copying. But Rome did not merely copy. It systematized. The Roman state mobilized its administrative machinery to construct a fleet at unprecedented speed. Shipyards were established along the coasts of southern Italy. Timber was requisitioned in enormous quantities. Skilled craftsmen were recruited, but so were untrained laborers. The goal was not artistry, it was output. The quinquereme became Rome's template. Larger and heavier than the Greek trireme, the quinquereme did not necessarily contain 5 vertical banks of oars. Instead, it likely employed 5 rowers across a vertical section, possibly arranged as 3 on the top level and 2 below, though scholarly debate continues. What mattered most was that it delivered greater mass and impact force. Such weight demanded stronger hulls. Roman shipwrights retained mortise-and-tenon joinery for plank connections, but they increasingly relied on robust internal framing. Frames were installed early in construction to define shape and provide reinforcement. Iron nails began to supplement wooden pegs more frequently than in earlier Greek practice, reflecting broader Roman access to iron production. The keel was thick and solid, capable of bearing heavy structural loads. Ribs rose at calculated intervals, supporting layered planking, secured tightly along the hull's length. The bow housed a reinforced ram, cast in bronze and mounted with structural backing designed to absorb shock. However, Rome introduced something even more distinctive than structural modifications: the corvus. The corvus was a boarding device, essentially a large wooden gangplank with a heavy spike at its base. Mounted near the prow, it could be dropped onto an enemy ship during close engagement, anchoring the two vessels together. Roman soldiers could then cross directly onto the opponent's deck, turning naval battle into infantry combat. This innovation altered the function of the ship itself. Where Greek naval tactics emphasized maneuver and ramming precision, Roman strategy prioritized stability during boarding. Hulls needed to withstand the stress of sudden weight shifts as soldiers crossed the corvus. Reinforcements were adjusted accordingly. Deck space became more important. Structural integrity during lateral strain required careful planning. The ship became a floating extension of the Roman legion. Constructing such vessels in large numbers required coordination far beyond individual master shipwrights. Rome organized production in phases. Keels were laid in parallel. Teams specialized in repetitive tasks: cutting frames, shaping planks, forging nails, casting rams. Timber acquisition became a logistical campaign in itself. Forests in southern Italy and beyond were harvested to supply straight trunks for keels and masts. Curved branches were selected for ribs, preserving grain continuity to maximize strength. Transporting this timber to coastal yards required road networks and river routes functioning efficiently. Roman administration excelled at such organization. Historical accounts suggest that within a remarkably short time, Rome constructed a fleet of over 100 quinqueremes. Even if numbers are debated, the scale is undeniable. Shipbuilding had entered an era of coordinated state production, yet speed carried risk. The early Roman fleet suffered catastrophic losses, not only in battle, but from storms. Heavy ships combined with limited maritime experience among crews proved dangerous in rough seas. Ancient sources describe entire fleets destroyed by weather, suggesting that rapid construction may have outpaced seamanship training. Ship design may also have contributed. Heavier hulls with less refined hydrodynamics were stable platforms for boarding, but potentially less agile during sudden shifts in wind or current. Rome learned through loss, just as earlier cultures had. Adjustments followed. Reinforcements were improved. Crews received more extensive training. Shipbuilders refined hull curvature to balance mass with maneuverability. The corvus, while effective, may have been abandoned in later years due to stability concerns in heavy seas. Rome adapted not through quiet artisanal evolution, but through relentless iteration under pressure. As the First Punic War continued, Roman shipyards remained active. Damaged vessels were repaired swiftly. Standardization allowed parts to be replaced with relative efficiency. Rams could be recast and mounted onto new hulls. Oars were shaped to consistent dimensions for coordinated rowing. The Mediterranean was becoming a theater of industrialized warfare. But Rome's ambition extended beyond warships. With Carthage eventually defeated, Rome gained control of vast maritime trade networks. Merchant vessels became equally important. Grain shipments from North Africa fed the city of Rome. Wine, olive oil, metals, and luxury goods moved along established sea routes. Roman merchant ships differed significantly from war galleys. They were broader, deeper, and designed primarily for sail power rather than rowing. A single large square sail, mounted on a central mast, could carry heavy cargo across long distances. Some vessels reached impressive sizes, capable of transporting hundreds of tons. Building such ships required mastery of weight distribution and hull volume. Frames were thicker, planking was heavier. Internal bracing supported cargo loads shifting during voyage. Bilge pumps were installed to remove accumulated water. Storage compartments were organized to stabilize weight and prevent dangerous imbalance. Unlike triremes, which were often hauled ashore after missions, large Roman merchant ships could remain at sea for extended periods. Their hulls were treated with pitch and protective coatings to resist rot and marine organisms. Shipyards expanded to accommodate these larger constructions. Harbors such as Ostia developed infrastructure for docking, repair, and loading. Warehouses lined quaysides. Cranes lifted cargo into holds. Shipbuilding was no longer only about combat dominance. It was about sustaining empire. Yet even in this era of scale, craftsmanship remained essential. Mortise-and-tenon joints continued to define hull integrity. Archaeological discoveries, including shipwrecks found in the Mediterranean seabed, reveal meticulous joinery. Tenons were fitted so precisely that gaps are nearly invisible even after 2 millennia underwater. Wooden pegs swell when wet, tightening joints further. This interplay between wood and water remained central to durability. Roman naval architects may not have written treatises comparable to later engineering manuals, but practical knowledge accumulated steadily. Ship proportions were remembered, successful designs were repeated, failures were corrected, and always, timber determined possibility. Roman expansion placed immense pressure on forests throughout the Mediterranean basin. Ship construction, siege engines, buildings, and fuel demands accelerated deforestation in some regions. The relationship between maritime ambition and environmental resource management became increasingly strained. Some historians argue that timber scarcity influenced later transitions in ship design and material use. Whether directly or indirectly, the connection between empire and forest was undeniable. By the height of Roman power, fleets patrolled not only the Mediterranean, but extended into the Black Sea and along Atlantic coasts. The Mediterranean itself was referred to as Mare Nostrum, our sea. Control of water was assumed. Shipbuilding had become an instrument of governance. But empires are not permanent. As political stability weakened in later centuries, centralized shipyard production declined. Trade routes became vulnerable to piracy and invasion. Naval maintenance faltered. Regional powers emerged. Yet shipbuilding knowledge did not disappear entirely. It retreated into smaller communities. It adapted to new needs. In the north, beyond the boundaries of Roman authority, another maritime tradition had been quietly evolving, one that prioritized flexibility over mass, speed over weight, and craftsmanship deeply rooted in forest knowledge. While Roman hulls grew heavy with empire, in colder climates, long, narrow ships were being shaped from oak in ways that would soon astonish Europe. The center of innovation was shifting. As Roman shipyards fell silent or diminished, the sound of iron rivets striking clinker planks echoed through northern forests. The Mediterranean model of plank-first precision would meet a different philosophy, one built not on replication at scale, but on intimate understanding of wood's natural strength. The sea remained the same, but the ships that crossed it were about to change once more. And in the fjords of the north, beneath winter skies, and among carefully tended groves of oak, a new chapter in ancient shipbuilding was preparing to unfold. As Roman authority receded from its distant frontiers, and the Mediterranean gradually fractured into smaller spheres of power, the center of maritime innovation shifted quietly northward. There, along the jagged coastlines of Scandinavia, shipbuilding followed a different logic, one shaped not by warm inland seas, but by cold waters, long winters, and forests that stretched seemingly without end. In these northern lands, the relationship between tree and ship remained intimate in a way the vast Roman shipyards had almost forgotten. Here, the vessel did not begin in an administrative order or a production schedule. It began in the forest, in winter, when the sap lay low in the wood and trunks could be felled with cleaner grain. The people we now call the Vikings did not suddenly appear as master shipwrights. Their expertise was the result of centuries of incremental refinement. Archaeological finds from earlier Germanic and Scandinavian communities revealed plank-built boats long before the famed Viking Age began. Yet by the 8th and 9th centuries, this northern tradition had matured into something extraordinary. The defining feature of these ships was clinker construction. Unlike the mortise-and-tenon hulls of the Mediterranean, where planks met edge to edge, clinker-built vessels overlapped their planks like layers of feathers. Each plank, called a strake, was fastened to the one below it, with iron rivets clenched over small washers. The overlapping edges created a hull that was both light and flexible. Flexibility was not weakness. It was survival. The North Sea and the Baltic are rarely gentle. Sudden storms roll in without warning. Waves strike at irregular angles. A rigid hull might crack under such stress. A clinker-built ship, by contrast, could twist slightly with the motion of water, distributing force across its overlapping planks. To build such a vessel required remarkable sensitivity to wood. A Viking ship did not begin with straight sword boards in the modern sense. Shipwrights split oak logs along the natural grain using wedges rather than sawing across it. This method preserved the strength of the fibers. Each plank retained the integrity of the tree's growth pattern, making it more resilient against bending forces. The keel was laid first, a long, straight oak beam carefully selected for minimal curvature. From it rose stem and stern posts, often elegantly curved to slice through water with minimal resistance. Unlike the heavy ramming bows of Mediterranean warships, Viking prows were sharp and narrow, built for speed and shallow draft rather than collision. The first strake was fastened to the keel, and then the next overlapped it, and the next, gradually building the hull upward. Iron rivets, forged locally, were driven through overlapping planks and hammered flat over small square plates called roves. Each strike of the hammer tightened the structure further. Internal ribs were added after several strakes had been attached, lashed to the hull with flexible cords made from animal sinew or plant fibers. These lashings allowed slight movement between frame and hull, enhancing flexibility rather than forcing rigidity. It was a different philosophy from Rome's heavy framing. In a Viking shipyard, there were no monumental docks of stone. Construction often took place near the shoreline, on simple wooden supports. Families and small communities participated. Shipbuilding knowledge passed from master to apprentice in close proximity, often within kinship networks, and yet the results were astonishing. One of the finest surviving examples of this tradition is the Oseberg ship, discovered in a burial mound in Norway. The vessel, dating to the early 9th century, reveals extraordinary craftsmanship. Its planks are thin yet strong. Its prow and stern curve upward in graceful arcs. Carved ornamentation suggests that aesthetics mattered alongside performance. But not all Viking ships were ceremonial. The longship, the vessel that would carry Scandinavian warriors across Europe, was engineered for versatility. It combined shallow draft with speed, allowing it to sail across open seas and navigate rivers deep inland. All oars provided propulsion when wind failed, and a single square sail harnessed favorable breezes. The mast could be lowered quickly, enabling passage beneath obstacles or during storms. The rudder, mounted on the starboard side near the stern, allowed effective steering even in turbulent waters. Balance was critical. Longships were narrow, sometimes less than 6 meters wide, yet could stretch over 20 meters in length. Too narrow, and stability would falter. Too wide, and speed would diminish. Shipwrights calculated proportions through experience rather than written formulae. The curve of the hull was determined by eye and by inherited knowledge. The forest supplied not only material, but form. Shipbuilders sought naturally curved tree trunks for stem and stern posts, minimizing the need to force straight wood into bent shapes. Crooked branches became knees, the angled supports connecting deck beams to hull sides. Every part of the tree was used where its grain aligned best with structural demand. Nothing was arbitrary. In winter, timber was felled. In spring, shaping began. By summer, a vessel might be ready for launch. The process required coordination, but not the centralized bureaucracy of Rome. It relied on intimate familiarity with environment and material. When these ships finally entered wider historical record through raids along the coasts of Britain and continental Europe, observers were struck by their speed and sudden appearance. Longships seemed to emerge from the horizon without warning, their shallow hulls gliding across water with unsettling ease. Yet their purpose extended beyond warfare. Viking cargo ships, known as nars, were broader and deeper than longships. Designed for trade rather than raiding, they carried goods across the North Atlantic: timber, iron, wool, furs. These vessels were capable of crossing open ocean between Norway, Iceland, Greenland, and even North America centuries before Columbus. Such voyages demanded extraordinary seaworthiness. Clinker construction proved well suited for ocean travel. The flexible hull absorbed wave energy, while the high prow shed water efficiently. Ballast stones placed along the keel stabilized the vessel. Cargo was stored low to maintain center of gravity. Modern experimental reconstructions have demonstrated the remarkable performance of these ships. When built using traditional methods and materials, Viking-style vessels have crossed the Atlantic under sail, confirming what archaeology suggests. These were not primitive craft, but sophisticated maritime tools. Shipbuilding in the north was inseparable from identity. A chieftain's prestige often depended on the quality of his ship. Burial mounds, containing full-sized vessels, testify to the symbolic importance of maritime power. Ships carried not only warriors and traders, but the dead, linking sea travel with spiritual passage. And yet, for all their elegance, these ships were built without the massive stone docks or large-scale industrial organization of earlier Mediterranean empires. Their strength lay in distributed knowledge and adaptable design. Iron, played a crucial role. Rivets had to be forged in sufficient quantity. Scandinavian bog iron deposits provided local sources of metal. Blacksmiths worked closely with shipwrights, producing rivets sized precisely for overlapping planks. Coordination between crafts was essential. Unlike mortise-and-tenon construction, which required precise carving of internal joints, clinker building emphasized rhythm and alignment along hull curves. The overlapping planks created natural longitudinal strength. Frames added lateral stability, but did not dominate structure. The ship was skin first, yet flexible. By the late 10th and early 11th centuries, Scandinavian influence extended across wide territories. Shipbuilding knowledge travelled with settlers to the British Isles, Normandy, and beyond. Techniques merged gradually with local traditions. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean and along European coasts, other ship types were evolving. Trade networks expanded again. Merchant guilds formed. Urban centres grew along shorelines. The need for larger cargo capacity returned, particularly in the Baltic and North Seas. Clinker construction would influence these developments profoundly, especially in the design of the cog, a ship type that would dominate northern trade in the medieval period. But before that transformation, it is worth pausing on the image of a Viking shipyard at dusk. An unfinished hull rests on wooden supports. Its overlapping planks catch the fading light, each rivet head reflecting a small glint of iron. The scent of freshly split oak lingers in cool air. Tools lie nearby. Adzes, augers, hammers. There is no grand administrative oversight here. No imperial decree demanding output. Only skill, memory, and the quiet understanding that wood, when shaped correctly, can endure even the harshest sea. As Europe entered the medieval period, maritime ambition would once again scale upward. Merchant leagues would require broader hulls capable of carrying enormous cargoes. Naval warfare would adapt to new political realities. Shipyards would expand in cities like Venice, where production approached industrial complexity long before the modern age. The flexible longship had proven what wood could accomplish in northern waters. Now ships would grow taller, heavier, and more vertical, and the next transformation would rise not from fjords alone, but from bustling medieval ports where trade, politics, and engineering converged once more. As the Viking longship carried Scandinavian sailors across cold northern seas and deep into European rivers, a quieter transformation was unfolding in the trading towns that lined the Baltic and the North Sea. The age of sudden coastal raids gradually gave way to structured commerce, guild charters, and negotiated alliances. Trade became less episodic and more constant. Markets required steady supply. Cities depended on grain shipments, timber cargoes, salt, furs, cloth, and metal. The ship, once optimized for speed and shallow draft, would now be reshaped for volume. In the growing ports of northern Germany and the Low Countries, a new vessel emerged, the cog. Unlike the sleek longship, the cog was broad, deep, and built primarily for sail. Its hull retained clinker construction in early forms, preserving the overlapping planks that provided flexibility and strength. Yet its proportions were entirely different. The beam widened significantly. The draft deepened. Cargo capacity increased dramatically. This was not a vessel designed to skim across water in narrow pursuit. It was designed to carry the economic weight of cities. The stern of the cog introduced a crucial innovation that would influence shipbuilding for centuries: the sternpost rudder. Earlier vessels including Viking ships, used side-mounted steering oars attached to the starboard quarter. Effective though they were, these steering systems limited maneuverability as ships grew larger. The stern post rudder, mounted centrally at the rear of the vessel, allowed direct alignment with the keel. Controlled by a tiller, it provided greater leverage and stability for heavier hulls. This development was transformative. With a central rudder, shipwrights could design taller stern structures and broader hulls without sacrificing steering control. It allowed the ship to grow vertically, and vertical growth was precisely what medieval maritime culture demanded, as trade networks expanded into what became known as the Hanseatic League, a powerful confederation of merchant guilds and market towns stretching from the Baltic to the North Sea. Ships needed to transport increasing quantities of goods over longer distances. Grain from Poland fed Western Europe. Timber from Scandinavia supported construction in England and the Low Countries. Salt and fish moved constantly between ports. The cog answered this demand. Its single large square sail, mounted on a sturdy mast, provided propulsion sufficient for bulk transport. The hull's high sides protected cargo from waves. Above deck, raised platforms at bow and stern, known as castles, offered vantage points for defense in an era when piracy and maritime conflict remained constant threats. These castles were not merely decorative. They represented the blending of merchant and military functions within a single hull. To construct such a vessel required careful calculation of weight distribution. The deep hull had to support heavy cargo without becoming unstable in rough seas. Frames were installed at regular intervals to reinforce the broader beam. Though clinker planking continued in northern traditions, internal structural support grew more significant as hull size increased. Shipyards expanded accordingly. In port cities such as Lübeck and Hamburg, shipbuilding became organized through guild structures. Skilled craftsmen apprenticed for years before attaining master status. Timber procurement involved contracts and regulated supply chains. Forest management became economically intertwined with maritime production. The forest once again shaped the fleet. Large, straight trunks were necessary for keels and masts. Curved timbers were reserved for structural knees, connecting deck beams to hull sides. Oak remained prized for strength and resistance to rot. Pine and fir served in lighter structural roles. As ships grew taller, the stresses imposed by wind increased dramatically. A large, square sail exerted tremendous lateral force. Without adequate bracing, the mast could tear free from its step. Shipwrights reinforced mast partners, the structural frames supporting the mast, and strengthened deck beams to distribute stress. Knowledge accumulated through experience, often paid for by disaster. Storms in the North Sea could devastate poorly balanced ships. Excessively tall superstructures increased wind resistance, raising the center of gravity. Gradually, builders refined proportions, finding equilibrium between cargo capacity and seaworthiness. While Northern Europe advanced bulk transport, Southern Europe witnessed a different kind of maritime evolution. In the Mediterranean, city-states such as Venice and Genoa competed for dominance of trade routes extending into the eastern Mediterranean and beyond. Their ships required versatility, cargo capacity for commerce, speed for competition, and defensive capability against rivals. Venice, in particular, developed one of the most sophisticated shipbuilding complexes of the medieval world, the arsenal. The Venetian arsenal was not merely a shipyard. It was an organized industrial system, centuries ahead of its time. Timber arrived from the forests of northern Italy and the Balkans. Craftsmen specialized in discrete tasks: keel laying, framing, planking, sailmaking, rope twisting. Components were prepared in advance and assembled efficiently. The Venetian galley, unlike the northern cog, retained emphasis on oar propulsion alongside sail. This dual system allowed maneuverability in the often wind-variable Mediterranean. Galleys were long and relatively narrow, but larger than ancient triremes, capable of carrying cargo and soldiers. Frames were erected first in many Mediterranean builds, marking a gradual shift toward frame-first construction methods. Planks were fastened to these frames, sometimes still using mortise-and-tenon joinery, though reliance on nails and metal fastenings increased over time. The arsenal's organization allowed Venice to produce ships at remarkable speed during times of war. Historical accounts suggest that multiple galleys could be completed within days when components were prepared in advance. This was not replication on the scale of Rome's wartime emergency, but it represented controlled, sustainable production integrated into civic structure. The ship had become civic architecture. Meanwhile, northern cogs continued to evolve. By the 14th century, some vessels incorporated carvel planking, where boards were laid edge to edge rather than overlapping, influenced by Mediterranean techniques. This method produced smoother hull surfaces and allowed larger ship dimensions, though it required more robust internal framing. The blending of clinker and carvel traditions reflected a broader cultural exchange. As maritime trade routes intersected, so did shipbuilding knowledge. Northern builders observed Mediterranean hull forms. Southern shipwrights encountered northern timber practices. Hybrid designs emerged, each suited to specific trade environments. Ships grew not only broader and taller, but more complex in rigging. Additional masts appeared. Lateen sails, triangular in shape, offered improved maneuverability against wind, especially valuable in Mediterranean waters. Rigging systems required stronger attachment points and reinforced decks. With height came risk. The increased vertical mass of masts and castles meant that hull stability was paramount. Ballast stones were arranged carefully along the keel to lower the center of gravity. Cargo had to be stowed strategically to prevent dangerous shifting during storms. Shipwreck archaeology reveals the consequences of imbalance. Vessels found beneath coastal waters sometimes show signs of catastrophic capsizing rather than gradual sinking. These silent remains offer lessons written in timber and sediment. Yet, despite the risks, ships continued to grow. Commerce demanded it. Insurance systems began to appear in Mediterranean ports, reflecting the economic importance of maritime investment. Written contracts described hull dimensions and cargo capacity. Ship ownership could be divided among investors, spreading financial risk. Shipbuilding had become capital intensive. And still, the forest remained central. As medieval Europe expanded economically, deforestation accelerated in certain regions. Shipyards consumed vast quantities of oak. Some states began regulating timber cutting to preserve future supply. The link between naval strength and woodland stewardship became increasingly visible. The medieval giants that crossed northern and southern waters were the cumulative result of centuries of experimentation. They were broader than Viking ships, taller than Roman galleys, and capable of sustaining trade networks that bound Europe together. But a horizon lay beyond Europe's familiar coasts. Rumors of lands Farther west circulated among fishermen and traders. Portuguese mariners began probing the Atlantic coastline of Africa, seeking routes around familiar land boundaries. Navigational tools improved gradually. The magnetic compass spread from East Asia into European use. Charts grew more detailed. Shipbuilding would soon face a challenge unlike any before it: sustained open ocean voyages far beyond sight of land. The cog and the galley, formidable in their domains, would not be enough. A new vessel type was emerging along the Iberian Peninsula, smaller than the cog, more maneuverable than the galley, capable of sailing into uncertain Atlantic winds. Its hull would combine northern strength and Mediterranean agility. And with it, shipbuilding would step into an age defined not merely by trade or war within known seas, but by exploration into the vast and unpredictable ocean beyond. The medieval giants had carried Europe to the edge of its mapped world. The next ships would carry it beyond that edge. And so, the coasts of Europe, long charted by cogs and galleys, began to recede into memory as mariners turned toward horizons that had never been touched by human hands. The Atlantic Ocean, vast and unpredictable, called for ships unlike any that had sailed before. It demanded vessels capable of carrying men, supplies, and ambition across weeks or months of uncharted waters. Vessels that could survive storms, currents, and the profound isolation of the open sea. In the shipyards of Lisbon, the air was thick with the scent of freshly cut pine and oak. Here, a shipwright bent over his plans, tracing the curves of a hull that would soon be assembled from carefully hewn timbers. His hands, blackened by pitch and sawdust, moved with the memory of generations. He knew that every plank, every rivet, every keel had to endure the uncertain wrath of the Atlantic. He traced the mast step with a gentle finger, considering the weight of sail and rigging that would harness the wind. Across the yard, apprentices lifted oars, hoisted sails, and checked iron fastenings, each step a rehearsal for the journey that lay months ahead. The ships taking shape were caravels and carracks, vessels born from centuries of maritime evolution. The caravel, small and nimble, could venture close to shore, exploring hidden inlets or following coastlines where larger ships could not pass. Its hull, often carvel-built with planks fitted edge to edge, was strong, yet flexible, able to flex with the waves without splitting. Its lateen sails allowed it to sail against the wind, an innovation the Portuguese had refined after decades of coastal exploration along Africa's western shores. The carrack, larger and broader, was capable of carrying provisions for months, housing cargoes of spices, gold, or settlers, and supporting towering masts with multiple square sails. Its hull required careful reinforcement to endure the pounding of the open Atlantic. Beams and knees were carefully lashed and braced, every joint calculated to resist torsion and storm-driven stress. Sailors, too, moved like shadows across the decks, preparing ropes, checking storage compartments, and stowing barrels of fresh water. No voyage had been undertaken like this before, stretching for weeks without sight of land. They examined the bilge systems designed to drain the inevitable leaks, the ballast carefully layered to stabilize the ship, and the compact cabins where men would eat, sleep, and work. Food was salted and dried, but water was precious, requiring barrels that could be sealed, rotated, and replenished as best possible. Shipwright and sailor alike shared a quiet understanding. The ocean would test both the timber and the human spirit. Columbus's fleet, soon to leave Palos, carried with it these cumulative innovations: La Santa Maria, the Niña, and the Pinta were more than simple vessels. They were a confluence of centuries of maritime knowledge, their keels traced back to the forests of northern Europe, their hull shapes echoing Viking ingenuity, their sails and rigging refined in Mediterranean harbours. And yet, for all the planning, they sailed into mystery. No chart could guarantee their course. No compass, though precise, could predict every current or gust. Every knot of wood and rope carried questions. Would the hull hold against a hurricane? Would provisions suffice for the men, the cattle, and the dreams they carried? And across the sea, the Atlantic offered answers in its own time. Storms would test the elasticity of planks. Calm periods would stretch supplies thin. The mastery of the shipwright was met with the patience of the ocean. But the design endured. Caravels flexed with the waves. The reinforced hulls of carracks resisted torsion, and men learned to read the subtle shifts of wind and water as carefully as the shape of their own decks. These voyages did more than chart lands. They transformed shipbuilding itself. Ports that had once built vessels for local trade began producing fleets capable of global reach. Timber yards expanded. Ironworks thrummed with rivet production. Sails were woven in standardized lengths. Shipwrights, once working quietly along isolated shores, now organized industrially, supervising dozens of craftsmen and apprentices, ensuring that every hull could be trusted for months at sea. Shipyards became centers not only of construction, but of empire, where ambition, labor, and knowledge coalesced into wood, iron, and sail. Unknowingly, each plank laid and each barrel stowed carried forward the memory of millennia. The Egyptian shipwright measuring mortise and tenon, the Greek craftsman balancing the oars of a trireme, the Roman laborer reinforcing hulls to withstand boarding devices, the Viking splitting oak for strakes that could twist with the fjord's waves, the medieval master calculating ballast for the cog and carrack. Every innovation, every adjustment, every measured curve converged in these ships that now dared the vast Atlantic, carrying empires yet to be imagined. And so, as these ships slipped quietly from harbour into the unknown, their hulls groaning softly under load, and the scent of oak and pitch mingling with the salt-laden air, the stage was set for an era in which trade, knowledge, and ambition would stretch across oceans. The caravel and the carrack were not simply vessels. They were the first engines of globalization, floating factories of exploration and commerce, carrying humanity's reach further than it had ever been. The Atlantic voyages marked a turning point. Shipbuilding was no longer merely regional or defensive. It was global, and the lessons embedded in each keel and plank would echo for centuries to come, shaping the ships of empires, the design of ports, and the very networks of trade that bound the world together. And so, quietly, the age of exploration had begun, and the shipyards, once intimate workshops by the water's edge, were now industrial centers, humming with ambition, knowledge, and the memory of all who had shaped wood into vessels capable of carrying humanity across the uncharted seas. And so, the world's oceans, once vast and unknowable, became the highways of empires. The ships that had braved the Atlantic and carried explorers to distant shores were only the beginning. As trade expanded and kingdoms vied for supremacy, naval power grew more complex, more deliberate, and more demanding. The era of sail had arrived, and with it came a level of precision in shipbuilding that surpassed anything the medieval world had yet known. In the bustling dockyards of Portsmouth, Chatham and Plymouth. The rhythm of hammers striking iron, saws biting through oak, and chisels carving every curve echoed across the riverbanks. The air carried a mixture of pine resin, pitch, salt, and sweat. Here, a master naval architect moved slowly among rows of half-finished hulls, his eyes scanning the curves of the keel, the spacing of frames, the alignment of planks. In his mind, he traced the stresses each timber would bear, the lift of sails, the motion of waves, the shifting of cannon during battle. His hands, scarred and darkened by decades of labor, touched each surface with the intimacy of someone who understood wood as both material and instrument. Shipbuilding had become industrial in its scope, yet deeply artisanal in its execution. This was the age of the ship of the line, vessels of imposing size, designed not only to endure the ocean, but to dominate it in battle. Their hulls, often 3 decks high, were carefully calculated for stability and firepower. Broad beams carried cannon ports along the sides, while deep keels and carefully distributed ballast ensured that the tremendous weight of guns did not compromise seaworthiness. Each plank was selected with precision: oak for strength, pine for flexibility, fir where lightness was necessary. The wood itself became a kind of living blueprint, its grain and curvature dictating how it could be shaped, bent, and fastened to the frames. The process began decades before a single ship touched water. Timber surveyors walked forests, measuring trunks, inspecting grain patterns, testing for rot and resilience. Some trees were marked with simple paint or carved symbols, standing silently until their time came. These marks would guide future generations of craftsmen, ensuring that keels and frames came from trees grown in ideal conditions. Some surveyors, whose work seemed invisible to most, measured not just the diameter of a trunk, but its history, the years it had grown, the storms it had endured, the soil that nourished it. This knowledge, gathered over decades, ensured a predictable outcome for the immense ships that would eventually carry men and cannon across oceans. At the shipyard, apprentices and journeymen learned the rhythms of construction. They lifted massive timbers, fit frames to the keel, and drove iron fastenings with steady hammer strokes. Each piece of wood was hand-shaped, steamed, bent, and corked. The hull grew slowly, rising from the dock like a wooden cathedral. Planks were laid edge to edge in carvel construction, creating a smooth surface that could resist the pounding of waves and the impact of cannon fire. Caulking, traditionally oakum treated with tar, filled every seam, ensuring that water remained outside. Craftsmen worked in unison, their movements coordinated through tacit understanding, guided by the rhythm of saws, adzes, and mallets. And yet, even as shipyards became centers of organized production, the risks remained profound. Wood, after all, is alive, its fibers responding to moisture, temperature, and stress. A single misaligned frame could compromise the entire vessel. Iron fastenings, improperly seated, might loosen under strain, allowing the hull to flex in ways that threatened its structural integrity. Sailors, once aboard, relied on the silent precision of the shipwright's hand. Every mast, every rope, every beam had to endure months or years at sea, under wind, salt, and cannon fire. The ship of the line represented the apex of this knowledge. These leviathans were designed to fight in coordinated fleets, presenting broadsides in linear formations that could sweep across enemy lines with devastating effect. The placement of guns required careful forethought. Lower decks bore heavier guns, upper decks lighter ones, each firing arc calculated for maximum coverage while maintaining balance. The hull's curvature, width, and draft were determined not only by hydrodynamics, but by weight distribution, ensuring that recoil would not capsize the vessel or strain the frames beyond their limits. Decks were layered with precision. The lower gun deck, often just above the waterline, required the strongest timber, meticulously caulked and reinforced. Above it, additional decks were framed to handle the weight of both men and artillery. Bulkheads and beams connected with mortise and tenon joinery, supplemented by iron bolts and braces. Each element contributed to a harmony of strength, balance, and resilience. The shipwright did not merely construct a vessel. He composed a symphony of wood, iron, and human ingenuity. Meanwhile, dockyards themselves evolved. Dry docks allowed hulls to be built and maintained below the waterline, where timbers could be treated, caulking renewed, and repairs undertaken without the influence of tides. Ships could be launched with predictable outcomes, rather than relying on beaches or slipways alone. Plans and blueprints, often drawn meticulously on parchment or scaled boards, became critical. These designs recorded proportions, frame spacing, ballast distribution, and deck layouts. No longer was shipbuilding purely empirical. It became a science, a careful calculation of forces, materials, and potential stresses. This precision extended to every aspect of naval logistics. Forests were managed with foresight. Timber was harvested with decades in mind, ensuring that a steady supply of oak, pine, and fir would remain for successive generations of warships. Surveyors measured growth rings, monitored soil quality, and tracked environmental conditions. Even the smallest deviation in grain pattern could influence the performance of a ship of the line under sail and under fire. Maritime power became inseparable from the stewardship of forests. In Britain, dockyards along the Thames and the Solent bustled with activity. Master architects oversaw construction, while apprentices and labourers carried out exacting tasks under their watchful eyes. Plans were debated, measurements double-checked, and every fastener accounted for. The naval arms race between European powers, Britain, France, Spain, and the Netherlands, drove shipbuilding to new extremes. Larger ships, heavier guns, taller masts. Speed became as important as firepower. Precision in construction could determine victory or defeat. Yet even as fleets expanded, questions persisted. How could a single forest sustain the needs of a nation's navy? How could shipyards maintain quality while producing ships in unprecedented quantities? Timber scarcity had become a strategic concern. Administrations began to catalogue resources meticulously, identifying forests, regulating harvesting, and calculating replacement cycles. The knowledge of centuries, of which trees grew best for keels, which branches made the strongest knees, which pine could bend without breaking, became an invaluable asset in naval strategy. Life aboard these ships intertwined with the shipwright's work. Sailors, trained in handling sails, rigging, and guns, relied entirely on the precision of construction. A poorly aligned frame could cause the mast to fail during battle. Improper caulking could allow water to flood the lower gun deck. Even small errors could be catastrophic in the chaos of naval warfare. The ship, in every sense, was alive, a living system of wood, iron, and human effort. Maintenance was continuous. Ships of the line were dry docked periodically for repairs and refitting. Hulls were recaulked, iron braces inspected, masts replaced. Sailors learned to work in harmony with these measures, understanding that the survival of the vessel and its crew depended on ongoing care. The discipline required at sea mirrored the meticulousness of the shipwright on land. And across oceans, fleets carried not only men and guns, but the accumulated knowledge of centuries. Each oak plank traced back to forests surveyed decades prior. Each rivet and brace reflected techniques refined through generations. Each mast harnessed winds once navigated by Mediterranean caravels and Atlantic caravel explorers. Naval power, at its peak, became both a technological and an ecological system. Ships were as dependent on forests as they were on cannon. Empire and wood were inseparable. The age of sail also demanded innovation in human organization. Shipyards evolved into quasi-industrial complexes, with divisions of labor ensuring efficiency without sacrificing quality. Timber preparation, framing, plank shaping, caulking, mast construction, rigging and sail weaving were all managed systematically. Apprentices progressed through ranks, absorbing knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries. The shipwright's hand guided, but the coordination of many hands enabled scale. Through all this, curiosity persisted. Even as fleets became formidable weapons of state, shipbuilders, mariners, and naval architects continued to refine designs. Hull curvature, ballast distribution, sail arrangement, and deck layout were never considered final. Experiments were undertaken quietly, often at the edges of a fleet, on small experimental vessels, or in controlled trials within dockyards. The precision required for ship-of-the-line construction coexisted with ongoing curiosity about how timber, wind, and human skill could be pushed further. Yet there were limits. Wood, for all its flexibility and resilience, could only bear so much. Hulls could grow broader, decks taller, and cannon heavier, but each addition increased stress. Masts strained under wind, beams flexed, and the force of repeated cannon fire tested structural integrity. Maritime engineers began to recognize that new materials would be needed to continue the escalation of naval power. Iron, abundant and strong, waited beneath the earth. Soon it would begin to reshape the fleets entirely. And so, as ships of the line filled harbors and fleets paraded along rivers, the culmination of centuries of shipbuilding knowledge reached its peak. From Egyptian rivercraft to Greek triremes, Roman quinqueremes, Viking longships, and medieval cogs and caravels, every innovation had led to this era of precision and power. Yet as timber was stretched to its limits, and as forests were carefully catalogued and measured to sustain navies for decades, the future whispered of change. The next era would demand iron, steam, and new ways of understanding both the material of ships and the oceans they sailed. The age of sail, majestic and disciplined, would soon give way. But for now, every plank laid, every rivet hammered, every keel traced across dry docks and rivers told a story of ambition, mastery, and meticulous care. It was a story of wood, hands, salt, risk, and imagination. A story that carried the memory of forests, the labor of generations, and the silent rhythm of oceans that had shaped human civilization for millennia. And so, as the age of sail reached its majestic peak, the world began to change once more. Timber, the silent, patient companion of civilizations for millennia, was nearing its limits. Forests, meticulously surveyed and managed for generations of shipbuilding, could only supply so much oak, pine, and fur. The mighty ships of the line, caravels, carracks, and galleons, had pushed wood to its ultimate potential. Every plank, every beam, every keel had been tested against waves, wind, and battle. The era of wood as the unchallenged material of the sea was drawing to a close, and a new element, heavy and unyielding, waited beneath the earth to transform maritime history: iron. Yet before steel and steam redefined naval power, there lingered a final generation of wooden marvels, hybrid ships that bridged centuries of experience with the nascent promise of modernity. These vessels bore iron reinforcement in their frames, yet their hulls remained lovingly crafted from timber. Each plank shaped by human hands, with knowledge inherited from Egyptian, Greek, Roman, Viking, and medieval predecessors. They were simultaneously the culmination of tradition and the threshold of transformation. In a quiet port somewhere along the English Channel, a master shipwright walked the deck of such a vessel. The wood beneath his hands creaked softly, echoing the centuries of knowledge embedded within it. Each plank, polished by salt and care, told stories of forests felled decades earlier, of hammers and adzes, of caulking stretched between seams to seal against the relentless ocean. Above him, the rigging swayed gently in the breeze, a complex network of ropes, pulleys and spars that spoke of the ingenuity of generations of mariners. The air carried the smell of tar, of resin, of timber, a perfume of human ambition and patience. The shipwright's apprentice moved alongside him, eyes wide with reverence. He traced the curvature of the bow, following the lines that had been calculated, measured, and refined countless times across centuries. "Why do we still use these old methods?" he asked. "Iron and steam could do it faster, couldn't they?" The master smiled, his hands lingering on the polished oak. "Because wood has memory," he said. "It remembers every storm, every sailors, every hammer strike. You can test iron for strength, but it will never bend with the sea as timber can, and it will never teach you patience." Across Europe and the Atlantic, shipyards continued to experiment. Hybrid designs emerged, combining iron bracing with wooden hulls. Some carried steam engines. Others retained sails for tradition and practicality. Mariners learned to balance weight distribution as carefully as their forebears. But now the dynamics included metal and machinery alongside the timeless behavior of wood. Even as innovation surged, the lessons of centuries remained essential. The choice of timber, the direction of grain, the flexibility of strakes, the curvature of keels. Ships were no longer purely wooden, yet they would not have survived without it. Unknowingly, archaeologists centuries later would uncover the legacy of this last age of wood. Shipwrecks, preserved in rivers, fjords, and coastal mud, revealed the ingenuity of master craftsmen long gone. Planks split and joined with mortise and tenon, iron nails embedded without cracking the fibers, frames lashed and braced with knowledge handed down through centuries. Each discovery offered a glimpse into the life of the ship, the challenges faced at sea, and the intimate relationship between humans and wood. Reconstructing these vessels became a science and an art in itself. Modern teams, blending historical research, archaeology, and experimental craftsmanship, sought to bring ancient ships back to life. Triremes, longships, caravels, each reconstruction required understanding not only measurements, but intent. Why a plank had a particular curve, why the grain was oriented in a certain way, why fastenings were spaced with precision. The process was laborious, demanding, and deeply educational. Every failure in a reconstruction taught more about the ancient methods than any manuscript or illustration could. In Norway, a team recreated a Viking longship using centuries-old techniques. They split oak by hand, steamed planks to achieve gentle curves, and lashed ribs with natural fibers. As the ship slid into the fjord waters, it flexed and rose with the waves exactly as the ancient builders had intended. Sailors experienced firsthand the elegance, resilience, and intimacy of a wooden hull. Each movement was alive with history, echoing the rhythmic strikes of hammers and the whisper of salt and timber. In Italy, a replica trireme glided across the Mediterranean, reminding historians and enthusiasts alike that ancient engineers had achieved remarkable precision. Rowers learned to synchronize their movements to minimize hull flex, understanding that each rib, each strake, each fastening contributed to the vessel's performance. Scholars observed how water interacted with the curved planks, how speed depended on both human energy and structural intelligence. It became clear that ancient techniques, honed over millennia, were sophisticated forms of engineering and knowledge management. And in every reconstruction, the oak tree returned. Each plank traced back to the forest, to the hands that felled it, to the patient shaping, seasoning, and joining. The story began with that tree, that single standing trunk, and followed through centuries of human ingenuity, empire building, trade, and exploration. The memory of wood persisted, not merely as material, but as witness, teacher, and companion. Maritime archaeologists observed that these reconstructions carried lessons far beyond history. The flexibility of wood, its ability to bend without breaking, its responsiveness to environmental stress, revealed insights into resilience and adaptability. Ships that had once seemed primitive were, in fact, optimized for their conditions. Hull forms reflected not only hydrodynamics, but centuries of empirical trial and error. The balance of materials, the tension in rigging, the alignment of frames, each was a culmination of human observation and intuition. In the modern age, the story of wood is both nostalgic and instructive. While iron and steel dominate naval architecture today, the principles developed with timber continue to inform design. Engineers study bending stress, load distribution, and hull dynamics, often drawing from the silent teachings of oak and pine. The patience, attention to detail, and intimate knowledge required to craft wooden ships are lessons in human craftsmanship and discipline. And so, as the last wooden hulls gave way to iron and steam, as hybrid vessels bridged old and new, and as fleets became industrialized and mechanized, the story of wood remained alive in memory and reconstruction. It was a story of ambition and patience, of risk and ingenuity, of salt and timber, of hands shaping history across centuries. Reflecting upon this, one returns, as all this history began, to the oak tree. In the quiet forest of the Mediterranean or the northern fjords, a single trunk stands. Its grain holds the memory of tools and hands, of men who dreamed of seas beyond the horizon. Its strength, its flexibility, and its quiet endurance echo through every keel, every strake, and every deck ever built from wood. Shipbuilding, in essence, is the story of civilization itself. Human curiosity measured against nature, patience applied to material, and ambition set afloat on waves of salt and wind. The forests, the axes, the keels, the ships, all are part of a single continuous thread, weaving together the collective memory of humanity's encounter with the sea. And as modern explorers, historians, and craftsmen rebuild ancient vessels, they rediscover not only technology, but philosophy, how civilizations lived, worked, and dreamed in tandem with the resources they could shape, and how the story of wood continues to teach patience, resilience, and the quiet power of human ingenuity. And so, the saga of shipbuilding, from the earliest rivercraft through the war galleys of Rome, the flexible Viking longships, the medieval cogs and carracks, the global caravels of exploration, and the majestic ships of the line, comes full circle. It returns to the oak, the forest, the hands, and the salt-scented air of shipyards long gone, but not forgotten. Wood, the first material of the sea, remains both memory and teacher. Every plank, every joint, every carefully bent timber carries the story of our civilizations, the story of our ambition, and the story of our enduring fascination with the infinite horizon. And as the last rays of sunlight fall upon a modern reconstruction, sliding into calm waters, one can almost hear the echoes of hammers, the whisper of sails, and the soft, persistent voice of the oak, reminding us that even as we innovate, explore, and conquer new materials, the story of wood, patient, resilient, and wise, will always guide the hand of the shipwright, the sailor, and the dreamer alike.